What does the following sentence mean? Do you have a clear idea as to what exactly that English sentence means? Are you sure? You understand what it means? Say it out loud to yourself and bear in mind that in actual fact there are 3 distinct ways in which you could pronounce it. I make pottery too. You're not the only one who makes pottery. I make pottery too. I make pottery too. I don't only sell it, I make pottery too. I make pottery too. I don't only make guitars, I make pottery too. This very simple sentence that only has 4 words in it can actually mean 3 quite distinct things in English. And it's very interesting to note that you can't tell which one of those meanings is being conveyed unless you hear it. You can't tell just from seeing it in its written form. Of course, we can write the stressed word in bold or in italics if we really want to, but that is an attempt in effect to mimic spoken language and the stress patterns that exist in spoken language. God himself can't tell what is intended by that sentence if he doesn't know where the stress is in it. Now, this sort of thing happens all the time in English. We take it for granted that English works like this, but it's actually a quirk of English that doesn't necessarily exist, and that certainly doesn't necessarily exist to the same extent in other languages. Think, for example, of the word only. I only buy blue cars. I don't buy blue motorbikes. I only buy blue cars. I don't buy red cars. I only buy blue cars. I don't mend blue cars. I only buy them. I only buy blue cars. I don't buy red motorbikes. Now, all of this, of course, is pretty trivial to the overwhelming majority of the people watching this video because they will, on the whole, be native speakers of English. But it's amazing how difficult it can be for non-natives to actually understand this stuff and use it accurately when they speak English. Take the following sentence, for example. Let's think of 2 different stress patterns that we could pronounce it with. I like jazz too. You're not the only one who likes jazz. I like jazz too. I like jazz too. I don't only like rock and roll. I like jazz too. In English, we can flick back and forth between those 2 different meanings simply by changing the way we use stress, but you can't do anything like that in Japanese. In Japanese, I like jazz too is going to be translated most obviously like this. And I like jazz too is going to be translated most obviously like this. Look at these 2 different Japanese sentences and see how this is done in Japanese. This is done grammatically by changing the particles. In English, you don't have to do any of that stuff. English and Japanese are very different in this regard. Now, we've spoken so far about whether or not English stress or Japanese pitch accent are lexical, whether you can create whether you can turn word A into word B by changing these things, by changing your stress or by changing your pitch accent. Here we're not looking at that. Here we're looking at the deeper structural function of these 2 different phenomena. Unlike stress in English, Japanese pitch accent, as far as I can make out, and I might be wrong, and if you think I'm wrong, you can tell me in the comments, as far as I can make out, Japanese pitch accent does not play any sort of role in this way in Japanese. I'm not talking about intonation in general. Japanese intonation is much more complex, of course, than pitch accent. It's not purely pitch accent. I'm talking here about pitch accent, which is to do with this drop in pitch between 2 mora, right? Japanese pitch accent just doesn't have this very, very fundamental structural significance, if you like, that stress does in English. The only example I can think of something that's a little bit like this is as follows. In this Japanese sentence here, we have お金がないから行けない, which means I've got no money, so I can't go. Here, both pieces of information are new from the perspective of the listener. Now look at the following sentence. お金がないから行けないんだよ. That means I can't go because I've got no money. Here, the listener already knows that we can't go. That's not new information. The new information is the reason we can't go. Because that's the new information, the pitch contrast is still very strong and distinct there. When it comes to the old information, the fact that you can't go, the pitch contrast dies away. Listen again. お金がないから行けないんだよ. So there's a flattening of the pitch in that part of the sentence that contains the old information, the known information. So there is something going on here in terms of directing the listener's attention to what's important and what's not. But this characteristic of Japanese pitch accent is a much less dynamic, much more passive, much less important structural role, in my opinion. Think of this English sentence. I'm going to sell the blue car at the market on Wednesday. Now there I stressed the word Wednesday, but I could have stressed any word here that's been put in bold. Given that there are 7 different words here in bold, that means that there are actually 7 different sentences lurking in this one sentence, depending on what you choose to stress. To speak English well, you have to be able to do all of this. You have to understand these distinctions and you have to be able to use them. Strictly speaking, you could stress more than one word, but then things just get too complicated and we can't think about all of that at the same time. So you can see that stress in English is incredibly important, and of course we haven't finished discussing everything that it can do. Think of the following, for example. The President of the USA lives in the White House. My friend lives in the White House across the street. You notice that I stress white in the White House, but I stress house in the White House. Why do I do that? Because the White House is a proper noun. It is a single discrete entity, whereas a white house is just a house that happens to be white. This is another thing that we do in English with stress. This is to do with compound nouns and so on and so forth, and you can Google it if you're interested. But if you are a native speaker of English, intuitively you already know, of course, how all this stuff works because it's a part of your language. The point I want to make here is that stress in English does all sorts of different things that pitch accent simply does not seem to do in Japanese. Stress is much more fundamental and much more important in English than pitch accent is in Japanese. Trying to speak English without using stress, without caring about stress, without learning about stress is like trying to make chicken soup without any chicken in it. What is interesting about Japanese is that many people, and I would include myself in this category, many people learn Japanese to a pretty advanced level and use it in their everyday lives and use it effectively in business contexts, in social contexts, in all sorts of different contexts without actually consciously knowing very much about pitch accent at all. So it seems that people who argue that pitch accent isn't that important are perhaps onto something. We're going to continue to think about this stuff in our next video. Thanks very much. Ciao ciao. Bye bye.